Maybe we'll get going and we'll just keep monitoring the waiting room and letting people in as we go. So Gwen, at the beginning of the session this morning, I had just briefly mentioned that you were going to be joining us. And so I'll just take a second to kind of recap that we have Gwen Phillips here with us. She's a member of the First Nations Information Governance Center Board. That's kind of national level. Then regionally, she's the BC Data Governance Champion, and a lot of the work that was done on the toolkit that we just toured in the last hour is drawn and inspired directly from the work of the BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative. And then working more towards the local level, Gwen's going to talk with us today about her leadership work within the Tunica Nation in data and data governance, and how it drives, as we talked at the beginning of the webinar, all of these associated government functions. Gwen's a very principled person, and kind of at a personal level, I just say a close friend and someone that I care about deeply. So I'm going to keep my camera on, Gwen, so that you can see someone engaging with you in this presentation, and otherwise I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Harmony. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm almost got a little teary there, getting to be grandma age here, and find myself becoming a very sensitive and very much appreciative for the people that have I've come to know over my journey. And that journey has been quite an interesting one. So, I'm from the Ktunaxa Nation. I'm actually from the community of Tobacco Plains, and I am someone that's worked for my nation for 37 years, starting out in the front desk, supporting Sophie Pierre. Some of you may know Sophie Pierre. She was and is a leader in British Columbia amongst First Nations people and Canada, and probably internationally known as well. And so my experience actually comes from front desk all the way to what I would say where I am now, and that's supporting governance transition. And even though I say I started at the front desk and I'm now at governance transition, I'll say that the journey was all about governance transition, because no matter where you sit in the organization within our communities, you are part of change management. You are part of moving things from what they were, what they are, to what we want them to be. And so we recognize within our structures, the hierarchy is not quite there in the same way it is in the other camps we sit in at times. And so for ourselves, recognizing that we are really servants of our people, and even more so servants of our creator, and so I've been privileged, I think, because I descend from hereditary chiefs, and my great-grandfather was the last hereditary chief of the Tunica Nation, who would be acknowledged as being a governance chief, intergovernmental relations. In fact, in 1916 in Ottawa, banging on the door saying, you know, recognize us as the Tunica. And so I say I'm privileged because I have the opportunity to continue that work. And to not only continue it, but to see change and to witness progress, which to me is the absolute life journey's payment. I'll say it's my payment. And as a Ktunaxa person, when I was asked as a child in the public schools, what do you want to be when you grow up? I used to say, I want to be a really good grandma. And my teacher would say, no, you know, what do you want to be? Something real. That's. And I'm like, well, my grandmas are really real. And they were kind of, you know, drawing me towards, what do you want to be, like doctor, lawyer, Indian chief? And really recognizing that those grandmother positions in my life and my community and my nation, and the roles that they played, were governors, were leaders, were very important. And so I am a grandmother now, and I think that having achieved this destination as grandmother, this designation, I guess, this work has become even more important as I see that I will now have the opportunity to hand off to my granddaughter, as we see call it fresh horses within my culture. So on the next slide, just want to start walking you through this deck, really acknowledging that for the Tanacha, we've kind of reconciled with our own self of where we sit in the concept of inherent rights, title, self-determination, self-government, Indian, Aboriginal, Native, all of the different labels have been thrown at us, and these different kind of relationships, I guess, that have been foisted at us for decades. We've kind of had to sit back and say, well, who are we? What do we do? And how are we sitting within this context that others have kind of placed us within? And really, it's an acknowledgement for us, which was a real important acknowledgement, especially as we were pushed, and I'll say pushed because we had no other real place to go, into the BC Treaty process. And it was sort of a process with a destination that said we would, along the journey somewhere, drop our rights and title, extinguish our rights and title, that we would sort of have to become something that other governments would recognize in sort of almost a colonial fashion for us to be successful in achieving a treaty. And so that didn't feel good, didn't smell good, didn't taste good. It just wasn't right for the Ktunaxa. And so we had to take time to figure for ourselves, where do we fit in this context and what are our beliefs? And so we acknowledge that Ktunaxa rights, Ktunaxa title is something that can't be extinguished. In fact, it's a covenant more so that we've created or was created at the time of creation. And it's something that each Ktunaxa shares. It belongs to us collectively, this identity as Ktunaxa people. And so with that, you can't extinguish the identity of the Ktunaxa people without committing genocide. And I don't think that's the track that treaty was thinking they were on there. So we pulled ourselves back from really thinking that our goal was to sign a treaty, and really saw our goal as being to become self-sufficient, to become self-governing, to be self-determining again, which is not so much what a treaty would do for us. It's an instrument. It's an entitlement potentially, or it's like, a driver's license doesn't mean you got a car or gas or anything. So we didn't necessarily see that as what our end goal was. We did know that we had challenges in our own territory with encroachment of others. And historically, we have the Sioux, the Kshakwepunk, the Ntlakapunk over there, just a little ways over, we know. We've got the Stoney, we've got the Blackfoot, we've got people all around us from the Ktunaxa Nation that we know historically as other nations of people, and that we have had battles with, we've fought with, we've died over, protecting our territory from the encroachment of other people, protecting our territory from acts of war and threats of alienation from our resources. And in colonial times, of course, sticking us on a reserve, putting us into these subordinate roles, not even looking at us as human beings at one point in time, or citizens of Canada. Again, who are we as a Ktunaxa? Well, we did not become these subordinates in our belief system. We acknowledge that we still have rights and title, that the rights and title that we have are actually more like responsibilities and privileges that come from that original relationship with the Creator, and that the jurisdiction we have is not really, again, what they think about jurisdiction. We kind of didn't feel good with that word, and it was a real challenge as we were moving ourselves towards, entitlement to be self-governing, thinking that we don't really want to write laws, because that's a colonial exercise. We have natural law, we have traditional law, we have law that tells us how to behave as people with each other, but we didn't have that as written down in such a form where we had to have, the branch of government to pass those laws, some kind of a legislature. We didn't have the executive branch and then the branch or the judicial branch to, slap us when we did something wrong. Our law was really about human behavior inside of other environments. And it was really much, very much a personal exercise. And we were driven towards behaving that way by our human development processes. So the jurisdiction we have in the writing of law didn't feel right to us. And we saw ourselves needing to go more towards an exercising of our self-determination. So we use a term, and you'll see it a little later on, juris action, that we actually just want to move our rights and title forward. We don't believe negotiation is necessarily the way to achieve that. And that in our own territories, we had to be the ones to actually establish the relationships, set the table and establish the relationships that we wanted with other groups. And so we saw Métis population, for example, they were starting to outnumber us as we looked around. We're a small population of Tunacha with a huge territory. So a lot of these, we'll call them foreigners, moving in, setting up camp, demanding rights and title. It's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. So we had to actually, ourselves as a Tunacha nation, set relationship with the Métis people. We have negotiated a protocol with Métis Nation BC, so they recognize the territorial jurisdiction of the Tunacha Nation. They know they're in our territory. They know they have no right to govern the lands of our territory. But we also recognize them as having personal jurisdiction. They can govern over their people. And so my nation has actually structured ourselves to provide services to Métis people in our territory. We want to make sure that our people are able to be supported regardless of where they are. So we, a long time ago, made decisions that we're not going to let these reserve boundaries or these program lines and sort of directives and policies get in our way. We will do what we know is right for us, and if it comes to a fight, we'll take it. And so we really see ourselves as just assuming and asserting authority, that it doesn't come, the functional authority does not come from a negotiation. You've got to build the capacity. You've got to do that internally. Please click. And so for the Tunacha Nation, again, acknowledging, sort of the approach we wanted to take as we move forward, we saw ourselves into this inside of a context of, again, no recognition of who we are. So we always get called these bigger labels. You're an Aboriginal person. I used to be a Native person at one time. I know I'm still an Indian because the Indian Act still exists. Now I'm called Indigenous, but they've included Aboriginal in Indigenous as one group, but the Tunacha don't recognize the Métis people as Indigenous. We do recognize them as Aboriginal. So it's like, again, who are we and how do we set a table? How do we relate to others? So we have to step out a little bit from our own self as a Tunacha to look around and see who is around us as neighbors. So we could do that nation to nation recognition, because we know there is not a government in Canada that's a colonial government that can actually give us recognition. They can't give us the recognition that's historic recognition, but they can recognize us in today as having historic roots, governing roots. They can acknowledge that. But as I said earlier, the Shuswap, we know them. We know the Shuswap people. We've got the historic relationships and contemporary relationships with them. And BC and Canada, diverse population. BC has 35, 36, 34 functional languages. Canada, 77 functional languages. So we've got a very diverse population. The Indian bands, the communities, the Indigenous governing bodies belong to those nations. We're part of those nations. So if we think about it, for us, Tunacha people belong to the Tunacha Nation, but we live in communities, we live in towns, we live in rural and remote regions, we live in a bush, we live in cities, we live in Vancouver, we live all over the globe. So it's important, again, for us to understand that sometimes our citizens live in the territories of other nations, and knowing who those other nations are and be able to relate nation to nation with other Indigenous governing bodies is really important to us. And giving the recognition to ourselves, not to accept any longer being called First Nations people. They've given the recognition to Métis, they've given the recognition to the Inuit. They have not necessarily given us a recognition as the Tunacha, the Intlakapan, the Shtatliam, the Shakapmuk, all of those Indigenous nations that belong to British Columbia. We've got to step into that identity. And some of you will know that there's been legislation passed lately, a language act, for example, at the national level as an attempt of reconciliation or something, but they didn't even include the languages. They didn't even include a connection between the Indigenous governing bodies, the nations, the languages, and intellectual property ownership, not recognizing how important our identity is to us, that's why we're individual nations, because of those languages we have. And the communities that we have are not the communities we had historically, and hopefully in the future we'll have more communities. And for the Tunacha, we recognize our community of people is wherever the people are. So we have a community of Tunacha that live in Vancouver in Coast Salish territory. We know that. So we've got to be able to relate nation to nation. And for my nation, we've asserted that if there are people from other territories that reside in our territory, we will certainly provide services to them. We provide services on and off reserve. as best we can with the policies and the fiscal framework the way it is right now. So I'll get you to click, please. You'll see on that previous slide, there was a connection to the Harvard approach, or the Harvard principles, or the Harvard work that was done. And a lot of us kind of allude to that and recognize that work that was done. And that early work was really an exercise in looking at what sort of factors related to success of Indigenous nations. Primarily at that time, it was United States nations, but First Nations, seeing what strengths, or what factors existed to see them be more successful. What were the success factors in place? And, you know, de facto sovereignty, of course, having institutions that are well functioning and have a cultural match, but also, of course, having some kind of a strategic orientation. And that is whether or not you're in a treaty process, whether you're self-governing, non-self, in my view, we are all self-governing. Every Indigenous nation in Canada, every Indigenous person should be self-governing. It's just how that recognition is given and what state or what label, again, has been put on us through time, through various policies and processes. So as we think of ourselves as being self-governing, that means self-determination. That means determining where you're going and who you are. And for ourselves, we saw so much emphasis of the other governments on recognizing us as Indians with problems. And I mean, if you go back far enough, you'll see that there were papers on the Indian problem. I mean, straight out, let's call it the Indian problem, and let's figure out what to do with it. And it's still that way. So if you look at the data that's being sort of made available to us, it's all attached to getting rid of problems. So they're looking at measuring our wellness by absence of disease, not by presence of wellness factors, because they don't know what those factors are of well-being in our communities, in our nations, in our cultural worldviews. So the Tanakh'a had to put down for ourselves, what do we view our strategic approach? How do we see ourselves moving forward as those independent community governments working together as a Tanakh'a nation again? And so how are we going to approach all of this work, both in negotiation and in nation rebuilding and community development? Well, our focus became this, that we wanted to look at building strong, healthy families, not getting rid of problems. So it required us actually defining for ourselves what is a strong, healthy family. You know, not accepting the proxies that they've given us of, you know, you don't have diabetes, that means you're healthy. You don't have heart disease, that means you're healthy. Well, not necessarily, because we understand, for the Tanakh'a perspective, we've got 4 cells, and each one of those 4 cells has to be healthy. The intellectual self, the spiritual self, the emotional self, and of course, the physical self, the containment, right? And so they're always looking just at the physical component and whether or not, and we know that those other selves will eventually manifest in physical ailment of some sort when they're not well. But if we can actually address those other cells before they get to the point of physical manifestation of sickness and disease, we've done ourselves a service. We've done something good for our people. So we want to build strong, healthy citizens and families and communities. And looking at the values we have as people again, not just looking to see how do we structure ourselves with a corporate this and a corporate that, and how do we manage these things, but really asking ourselves, what do we value as Tanakh'a people? What is it that we will die for? You know, because at one point in time, we died on the war battlefield. We died for these things. So what is it we will? Again, you know, what do we share in common? These processes, when we were going through defining and trying to figure out what it is that's important to us again, they are such important processes to go through. And so the Tanakh'a determined a long time ago that process for us is more important at certain points in time than product is, than having something out the other end of it. That if the process is done well in building people's confidence, in building trust, in engaging in a healthy way, then that actually has achieved the outcomes, not just stopped with the outputs of our government. So when we think about balancing across the sectors, again, absolutely critical, because again, you know, they look at us like people with problems and not recognizing that when we think of the social environment, the social sector, when we think of the economic sector, when we think of the physical lands, environment, stewardship sector, we as Indigenous people don't see a disconnect or don't see a separation between the health of the land and the health of our people. when those other governments and the majority of Canadians in this capitalistic kind of thinking see this clear separation. That land is to be used for the benefit of us as people, for us to get rich and wealthy. Well, wealth does not generate health. It's been proven. And for us, again, as a Tanacha, money is not necessarily what we're trying to achieve. It's those healthy people in healthy communities, in healthy systems, etc. So we had to ask ourselves, how will we balance the movement towards the common vision, knowing that there's a heavy investment in social areas, we get almost no money for traditional knowledge and language, so we're the ones who will have to invest in that, et cetera, et cetera. So it became for us a process of having to really determine what's important to us, you know, and you can read these other concepts embedded in our strategic approach. But I'll tell you one of the most important ones, and we're really focusing in on this right now, is managing an economy, not just economic development. And this is where a lot of us end up in trouble. We build it and think they will come. But in fact, our people are not healthy, well people yet. So we can create all kinds of economic development opportunities, and then we see them not being able to hold the jobs, or the jobs aren't for them, or we've got other people in those jobs. We're having to bring other people into these economic development initiatives in order to maintain those high standards that are expected of them. You know, you operate a tourism adventure of some sort, and you better keep that quality up there, right? Otherwise, you're not going to have the repeat customers, and you're not going to build that base. So we know that we've got to do an internal economy, and that requires us knowing every Tanacha intimately, having data on every Tanacha, and not like Big Brother. And you'll go back to understand that if you look to the BC government right now, they've just commissioned a report from the Human Rights Commission in BC to look at disaggregated data. And so I was part of the group that, you know, helped to form this report, you know, one of the informants, not the writers. And they picked up on a phrase that I used, which is, we don't want to be like Big Brother. The concept for Indigenous people in data is to be more like grandmother. We want to know because we care, not because we want to hold you. We want to, you know, crush you. We want to, you know, be able to manipulate you. No, it's because we care. And so that in itself, that philosophy of because we care, is so integral. And so when we're asking ourselves about what data do we need? What data do we not need? You know, we don't need to be collecting data that is just, why do we need to know that? No. And so, you know, a principle that we kind of put to the table is we need to know when we're relating to the other governments and we're relating to a person's coming forward, you know, you don't need to know what color my eyes are. You just need to know I can see, right? So the personal data is personal. It's important to me as an individual. You don't need that level of detail. You need to know that I can see and that I can see clearly. And basically what that means is I own myself. I own my data. I am self-determining as an individual, but I'm a Tanacha individual. And the services and the supports around me have got to acknowledge that and own what they own as in my journey, supporting my journey towards well-being, et cetera. Because our people say, we say rebuilding our nation one person at a time. We have another philosophy that says blame, shame, and guilt is no foundation for this nation. And so we acknowledge that we're made up of a lot of broken, hurt, and healing families. And we've got to actually be able to support the healing journey of our people as we move towards, again, self-government, self-determination. And it's an incremental journey. It moves, you know, it's not that's a thing, let's jump forward to it. The people have got to be the ones that they are self-government. They are self-determination. And so it's important to understand the difference between governance and government. And this, again, is a big recognition for the Tanacha and almost a reconciliation, again, we're doing internally right now. So click, please. And so a piece of the work we're doing right now is to separate out the concepts of community development and nation rebuilding. So recognizing that there are 4 Tanacha communities, all with unique interests, with unique geography, with unique histories, unique families, etc. But they belong to the Tanacha nation, the common Tanacha speaking peoples. So the indigenous governing bodies of the Tanacha nation have got to really be able to support the community people in those communities where they are. They've got places, services, houses, dog bylaws, the dailies to deal with. That's community development, making sure that the environments that the people are going to be in are the healthiest environments possible, and that the policies in that environment support people to move towards health and well-being. Governance, setting standards, setting strategic direction. And for us as a Tunacha, governance comes from the ground up. And so understanding land, to the Tunacha is natural law. When we put it from a tichis to a tichis, it becomes a human behavior inside of that natural law. And so governance for us is recreating the standards, the belief systems, the values. It's about empowering institutions to do the work that's necessary with that belief system, with that spirit of Tunacha from the ground up. And then when we talk about Tunacha government, those are the institutions we create to move us towards that vision of the future. Our child welfare agencies are, more importantly, our healthy child development agencies, our human resource development agencies, all of those things we're going to do for and with our people to bring us back to that state of what it is we want for ourselves as healthy, vibrant peoples. And so understanding the difference between governance and government, and that we've got to heavily invest in governance, that's totally Tunacha. Then when we've got that flavor, when we know what that is, we empower those institutions and we can hire anybody, Tunacha, non-Tunacha, whomever, but they perform their work in accordance with the standards set by Tunacha. So governance has to be Tunacha people doing that work, but the institutions that serve us can be made up of anybody, as long as they're doing that work in accordance with the values, principles, policies, practices that we said we want in place. So this was a real important reckoning for us, because many of our leaders, because of having been around a long time, have been heavy on the government side, really involved in institutional operations, budgets and all of that stuff. And that's really not what they should be doing. They need to be setting the principles for how budgeting occurs, setting the processes in place and the policies, et cetera, the standards by which. So, for example, we talked about in the Tunacha, in our early work, that ecological integrity took precedence over economic gain. That was a principle we had because we valued our land so much. And so then when we started to think about governance, that's an exercise of governance, economic integrity or ecological integrity, taking precedence over economic gain, right? That's a very philosophical thing. But then when you go down into the government of the Tunacha, into the land sector, into the economic sector, into the operations, they got to look back at that, and every time they're making a decision, ask themselves, is this going to impact the land in such a way that we can't bring it back to health? It starts to be a test of our decision-making. It starts to guide decision-making. When you do that the exercise well in governance, then government becomes more accountable. It can operate in a transparent manner and do the things it should do to lead you to where you want. And right now, our structures are not there yet. Partly, the Tunacha have partly gotten there. We've got interim, I would say, agencies, but we haven't fully empowered them to do the work necessary because we haven't fully finished that work. It's incremental, it's iterative, and we have to start with the people. Our vision starts with strong, healthy citizens and communities, strong, healthy citizens. And as we start to rebuild the strength of the people, they start to actually better determine what it is they want from the future. And they start to really recognize where their personal actions, their personal behaviors, et cetera, cause impact on community, in community, et cetera. So this process of engagement, the process of community development and nation rebuilding, those processes, governance, government, two conjoined, have to move together. One informs the other, and you can't let the government processes get too far ahead of the governance work. It's really important. But we have processes, cycles, so you don't do it all at once, every year. So please click. And for the Tunacha, again, we understand that our processes, our cycles, we've got to look back to move forward. So we have in our structures, historically, societies. And you see the term societies on here. This is not the nonprofit, corporate BC, 5 people aboard, here you go. No, these societies are societies that actually were in place, it's the label we're using to describe them, in place historically, that performed extremely important functions of governance for us. And so when we think about the function of leadership, we're not talking about just those people who are elected through the, those processes we have. We're actually putting redefining the roles of leadership, the functions of leadership. And we're acknowledging that historically we had, for example, a grizzly bear society, a crazy owl society, a crazy dog society. And these societies, these groups of people, these organized bodies of people in our communities and across our nation performed very important functions for us. For example, our crazy owl society hasn't been functional probably since colonial, right? But that crazy owl society was a women's organized society that took care of pandemics, epidemics. We didn't know about pandemics, but epidemics that took care of sickness in the camp. We don't have them anymore. We have health nurses and epidemiologists and all of these other folks, but we don't have our own internal approaches to even understand and recognize sickness in the camp. And we are not just talking about things like COVID. We're talking about spiritual sickness, recognizing that in the camp. And for us, that is what we see as one of our biggest issues right now, is spiritual sickness in our people. The damage that's been done to our people's spirit is massive. And so they're emotionally unwell and mentally unwell in many instances. So we have got to go and put that spirit back, help to put that spirit back in our people. And so we're talking about how we now, for example, again, right now in the winter season for the Tonacha, very important, we go into cultural dances, we have jump dances, we're talking about planning our road forward for the next year. It's strategic planning, but engaging the spirits to help us in this work. Now, when we've been pushed into the boardroom, we've left that spirit somewhere. So we're talking now about having to actually maybe move things out of the boardroom so the spirit can reconnect, or finding ways to really literally bring the spirit back in the boardroom so that we can do our work in the ways Tonacha need to do their work for it to be feeling well to us and to be supported by the spiritual energies that we know exist. For the Tonacha, we recognize that everything has spirit. It's not just a spirit, but spirit. So even paper, even a rock, they have spirit. And so the relationships and the energy and the recognition of how we have to behave and how we have to treat things, it's massive. So it starts to, again, as we remember these things and we start to breathe these things back into our own processes, we feel good about it again. So those functions of governance have got to be very, Tonacha oriented. And one of those functions, of course, information management and technology. What information do we need to know whether we're culturally well, to know whether or not our men and women are doing well as unique populations and our LGBTQ, etc. How do we know that we're doing well educationally? My nation did not adopt the proxies that were being sort of presented to us on a treaty conversation for measuring well-being. Example again, education. They kind of want us to do a gap closing exercise, and they keep talking about gap closing. And so the Tonacha kind of put this out in front of us. The gap we want to close is the gap between who we are and who we want to be in the future, not the gap between, education levels and diabetes rates and other things that they suggest is what is important in this relationship with the other governments. And so when we think about education, the Tonacha know, because of research we undertook, that we have in our adult population now approximately 40% fetal alcohol affected individuals. So FAS, FASD, ARBD, however you want to label it, but basically acknowledging that at least almost half of our people have challenges in daily understandings, have challenges just doing daily life, and maybe challenges with who knows, the extreme, the condition, fetal alcohol exposure can be everything from just a little bit of challenge with memory to full-blown can't deal with the dailies and end up in incarceration. So when we looked at our work, we had to put metrics, put measurements to these things that we wanted to measure that actually meant meaning to us, were meaningful to us. So knowing that 40% of our school-age population back then, which is now our adult population, were potentially fetal alcohol affected, and we thought about education and the proxies for it, we really wanted to make sure that our measurements were recognizing the uniqueness of each individual and that it was their strengths, their objectives, their learning outcomes that we were supporting. So our measurements for education are more attached to individual education plans and success inside of those plans. The number of Danacha citizens successfully achieving their education plan, not graduation, but whatever it is in it. It may be graduation, post-secondary, doctorate, whatever, but it might be being the best wood carver in the community again. It might be being the one who actually understands the language and can speak. Because for us, that job is just as valid as a social worker right now. Somebody speaking the Danacha language fluently is a critical job right now. So how we define what a job is, what our employment and working conditions are, that's up to us. We use this common framework you see on the screen because the other governments are kind of familiar with it. And it allows us to take this place, for example, when we think about the determinants of health, put Danacha in there where it says culture. And then think about all of those other determinants from that perspective. The Danacha culture, what is the gender relationships in Danacha culture? How did we do this? Well, we already had men's and women's societies. Not to say you couldn't be an LGBTQ, we had that, we recognized that. So again, how we go about defining what our institutions need to do for us, how we measure the effectiveness of those institutions, that is self-determination and self-governance unfolding over time. It's an incremental thing. As I say, people become healthier, they determine what it is, something they want for themselves. It might not have been what it was before as we go through these processes. So for us moving forward, it's going to be over the next while, reflecting back on sort of what we've done over the past 10, 15, 20 years in moving our governance forward, and then having to actually think 10, 20 years into the future, because we're trying to be as respectful of our traditional concepts as possible, moving back to as many generations as we remember. Some say 7 generations. For the Danacha in our language, we have wordage that takes us 5 generations. So we know for us, it's at least 5 generations back and 5 generations forward. So that's the window we want to use as far as our planning goes, and thinking about how far our strategic thinking has to be. So click, please. That long-term journey, if you don't have a roadmap for it, you get all kinds of distractions, okay? A lot of people will shine something at you. They'll say, road needs a construction over here, so you take a detour, and pretty soon you're lost again. You don't know where you're going. So having a very high-level guide was really important for us as Danacha peoples. We're 20 years into this in a real intensive way. Our work in putting a vision to paper started, it was in year 2000. We'll go back another couple decades as far as our movement towards self-determination, and we've always felt that way. But really in managing our own processes and putting our own process in front of us, it's been about that 20-year mark now, 21 going on here soon. And we acknowledged in that we needed to have a long-term frame that allowed us to be flexible along the way and to take as long as we needed to do the work necessary to make sure that the people were the ones driving the process and not some consultants and not a few elected folk. So we had to, come up with structure, process, etc. And so as we thought about it, it was citizen driven. Absolutely everything had to be citizen driven. So our treaty negotiations, for example, would consist of 300 Danachas in a room. And we would be talking about something like revenue sharing or something like that. Defining principles from our people, getting them to identify what our values are again and what the principles are. So it always was a broad exercise of engaging our citizens in these philosophical exercises so that they could actually be brought into a practical space in a way that they would see themselves in it and support the movement, the processes moving forward. So the vision that we set in the year 2000, very important. Then it had to go out into the citizens. So because it was initially penned by the leadership, but it had to go out to every little nook and cranny of our communities for recognition, is this a good thing? And for some opportunity to edit where necessary. And there were some edits made to the initial statement. And the statement as it sits now is something that guides almost everything we do again, but it's very high level. It's philosophical, and you'll see it here in a page or so. That vision then has to become something more meaningful. Yeah, that's where we're going. How are we going to get there? The values we have, the guiding principles. When we start to think about law, policy, etc., that kind of regulation of our philosophy, that's down the road a ways. So my nation actually agreed. Right now, we can exist in the legal framework of the other governments for the most part, right? The legal framework, the policies that exist under that, the directives, the way they do it, the programs and services, those things have choked us forever. And the standards that we have for certain things, they don't even have any recognition of it being a valuable thing. So we may have some need to create some kind of regulation that doesn't exist in their environments, the other governments' environments, for our own purposes and for educating other people. We also acknowledged early on that it wasn't just one stream of work that was going on, that we had three distinct streams of work that were going on, but they all had to be connected and they all had to be managed and coordinated. Otherwise, again, we get kind of out of balance, and we end up with an institution driving a process rather than the people. And so we acknowledged we had individual health and wellness plans that were important, that each person, so we have a saying, rebuilding our nation one person at a time. So knowing the families, knowing what they are, and understanding that that's the only place that change can happen. When we think about change, change management, moving to self-governing, you can do as much as you want on paper, but if it's not in the heart of the people and the people aren't the ones that are moving the process along, et cetera, it's fun. It's an exercise, but you still feel bad at the end of the day because the people are still in the same place they were. And that's not what our job is. Our job is actually to have strong, healthy citizens and communities. So those individual plans supported by community development plans. So we know we have to measure individual health and wellness, but we have to measure communities because our vision includes strong, healthy communities. So what is a strong, healthy community? And that's more looking, as I was saying, about places and spaces and infrastructure and buildings. So knowing what it is that helps support individuals to become healthy. And then the nation rebuilding plans also important. And that's about those institutional standards. So no one community will be left behind. When we think of our 4 communities, some have more economic opportunity because of where they are. So we're not going to leave the Ktunaxa community or citizens out over there. So our investment strategies as a nation have to ensure that we put principles of equity in. So we distribute our resources in an equitable manner so that every community, every family, every individual can actually be moving themselves towards that concept of what strong and healthy are. And I use the concept of juris action there again, because we don't necessarily need to write a lot of law right now. And if we busy ourselves with that, that's where our energy goes. And in fact, having our people reminding ourselves of the natural law, reminding ourselves of human behavior, how we're supposed to behave. It's been proven, we know it, that when people know how to behave and are grown that way, you don't need a lot of policy and regulation. You don't need to. And the more we've moved away from that, the more we need to regulate those environments, right? So it's going to be, again, iterative. We've got to rebuild strong, healthy people as we move towards these concepts of what strong, healthy processes, et cetera, are. So click again, please. We've done a lot of philosophical work, as I said. We've done a lot of work putting objectives and things in front of us, and it's going to be difficult for you to read this. I don't expect you to. These documents will be shared with you. But as we looked at the vision, values, and principles, this is just an example of how they would actually be put pen to paper. And so an example here, again, the vision we have for the Ktunaxa is that strong, healthy citizens and communities speaking our languages and celebrating who we are and our history and our ancestral homelands, working together, managing our lands and resources as a self-sufficient, self-governing nation. Ktunaxa nation looks good on a t-shirt, looks good on a poster, got it on mugs, etc. Well, what does it mean? And how do we know we got there? So we had to start now where we are now because we've done this 10-year strategic framework. It's ended in 2020. We're looking to refresh it now. We've got these beautiful philosophical statements, something like, if our value is that self-governance is an inherent Dunacha right, our principle, we declare and assert our responsibility for governance throughout Dunacha traditional territory. Then a goal in relation to that is to secure governing authority, inherent right across Dunacha territory. So But now we're saying, have we done it? Have we done it? This treaty process where we have we done it? Well, we don't know. So we're now talking about taking this framework in this philosophical goal place. We're good at this, but now attaching the measurements to it. 1, 2, 3 things we need to measure in relation to each one of these things to know we've achieved it. And this is just a tiny slice of what the strategic framework is. The framework includes lands, includes social, includes traditional knowledge and language, corporate structures, etc. So it's a big strategic framework, but we haven't necessarily put the measurements in place to know and to be able to then report back to the people on what that framework, what those commitments that we made to each other and that they told us, were important to make. And that's what we're doing right now, going back to engage the citizens in refreshing the strategic framework and asking them, what are the 2 or 3 things that we want to measure to know we've achieved these things that you said are so important to us, these goals that you've set. So click again, please. And in that, knowing that there are different levels of measurement, different levels of indicators that we need to develop. So yes, we're going to develop indicators that attach to a strong, healthy Dunacha. And we've done a lot of that work. What is a strong, healthy Dunacha? But we've also got to look inside of that because the environments around that individual, the environments drive the circumstances, drives the behaviors. That's what social determinants are. A person's personal characteristics, their behaviors, and the circumstances, the environments they're in. So as we shift an environment, as we change the environment, social, physical, economic in the community, through policies. We've built a beautiful health facility, for example, that actually is representative of the culture, includes the elders' room, includes smudging places, includes sweat house, etc. As we shift the environment, then the people's behaviors start to shift. And so then we see us wanting to look at measuring the institutions. So we want to measure the people, we want to measure the environments, we want to measure the institutional performance inside of those environments. So how well are our programs and services working in doing that in these environments to achieve those outcomes? And then we're also looking to measure relationships internal, but more critically, relationships external with the other governments. And so developing our own nation, community-driven and nation-based, because we talk about community and collective governance, and that's the nation component, collectively, community-driven, nation-based performance management system. Sounds really sounds really like self-governing, sounds really non-Dunacha, but no, in fact, it is Dunacha because we had performance management systems historically. We had a duck chief, a deer chief, a camp chief, a war chief. We had these societies that actually managed performance of individuals, of families, of the institutions themselves. So it's not a foreign thing. It's got to be put in context with ourselves, our cultural worldview. And we've got to put processes in behind this to ensure that it's a continuous, and this is what our people said to Dunacha, continuous quality improvement. We know we can't do it all at once. And so we said, if each generation of Dunacha can move one step closer to that concept of the eventual strong, healthy citizen community we want to gain, we know we've been successful. So having the measurements that matter so we can actually put that back into the hands of our people. So one more click, please. We're almost done, folks, almost. I plan to pick it up here. You'll get these slides as was mentioned. And so again, we said to ourselves, because before we used to sort of do planning separate from thinking about what we were going to measure, that was evaluation and that was done at a different time, right? Well, no, actually you got to do them both together. So now we're thinking exactly as we're thinking, what is it we're going to go ahead and click because this thing's going to unpack. As we're doing that planning, identifying the goals, objectives, strategic activities, et cetera, some logic model thinking, we've got to think about what's going to go in to enact that plan. What's going to make that plan come to life? The inputs going into that plan to make those activities come to life. the outputs coming out of those activities. Kind of, we used to stop there, right? We used to be like, did you do the workshop? Yeah, we did the workshop. How many people came? 15. Yay! Now we're going, did anything change because of the workshop? Has anything changed in the lives of those 15 people that participated in it? So we're moving ourselves to actually look at the outcomes, and you'll see there's 3 little indicators. Click again. So what are the indicators that relate to that? Because those indicators attach to results. Results is what a government wants. Performance measurement, going back to see whether those goals have been achieved. And that's why it's a process. It's a cycle. It's not a beginning and an end. It's continuous quality improvement. You see what's happened with the results of what you've done. You hopefully adjust what you've done. Because when you always do what you've always got, you always, where does that saying go? You always do what you've always done. You'll always get what you've always got. Something like that. Yeah. Yeah. If you always do it, you kind of crazy thing. There's another thing about that one. So yeah, we want to try differently, not harder. We want to make sure that what we're doing is putting a plan in place that's got solid measurements. And then we say, can we measure it? Do we have the systems? Do we have data collection to measure this? And so it might be implementation of a survey. It might be 2 more questions on an intake and an outtake form for your programs and services. You've got to figure out, how do you catch that data? And looking at the integrity of that data over time. It's not one exercise. It's an all long-term journey. So you've got to look at things that might relate to standardization of data. So putting some standards around what it is you're going to collect, when are you going to collect it, in what form you will collect it, how you will use it, and how you will report back to your people. Because that's, again, what this is all about. It's not about job justification. It's about ensuring that we're moving towards the well-being that we want for our people. So click again, please. Overarching framework. Some of you may have seen some of this work already in thinking about the BC Data Governance Initiative. The Toonaka Nation, one nation trying to do this work for ourselves. It was like a salmon going the wrong way. You know what that's like when there's 4 or 5 dams on the river, right? So we actually saw ourselves not alone. There were other nations in BC doing similar work. And so what the BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative is a collaboration of BC First Nations in trying to advance their data sovereignty, advance self-determination, figure out, how do we begin measuring what matters? And how do we educate the other governments in this? And so it was a tripartite table set for the federal, provincial, and a number of First Nations governments to really start testing this in-between space of, are you willing to let go, feds and provincial government, as we assume the responsibilities for measuring what matters? So, they should not be measuring the individual health and wellness of Toonaka people anymore. That's my government's job. They should be measuring those things that matter, like institutional indicators. Are their institutions serving our people well in their environments? Because it's not just about us building good services in our environments, under our control. Those other governments still serve a lot of our people, and the standards by which they serve them are maybe not up to snuff. Some of you may have seen the work that's happened in BC lately around anti-Indigenous racism. And that report that has been tabled lately on data, it's all about relationship indicators. It's all about institutional indicators. And it's all about basically shifting the relationships that exist so our people can start being more in control of their own experiences in service. So having a voice in determining what is a quality service and how do I actually bring my voice out when I have not experienced that. So we want to work together with other nations, because we know our people are not just served in our own communities, they're served elsewhere. So working collaboratively and then helping to inform the other governments on what they can start releasing, what they can start, even understanding. What we want to measure is different than what you want to measure. We will measure things that we can all agree to. So we can have provincial and national level outcomes that we all aspire to. But for us as self-governing nations, do not ever agree to close a gap between yourselves and them, because that to me is assimilation, measuring assimilation. So the gap you want to close is the gap between who you are, who you want to be, having our people be the ones to define what those things are, but having them attached to things that we all agree to. For example, there should be opportunities for our children and youth to enhance a sense of self-identity and belonging that is rooted in our Toonaka culture, values, beliefs. Opportunities for them to enhance a sense of identity. There should be those things in place. What those opportunities are, where they are, et cetera, that's for us to determine as the Tunacha. We should have healthy, self-supported First Nations children, youth, families, and communities. Absolutely. What that looks like for the Tunacha, the Intlakapen, the Dene, the Mi'kmaq is different. So that's self-determination and why we've got to go through these processes individually. But the other governments know that every one of our processes will lead to what we have in common, what we share in common, which is health and well-being for the Indigenous peoples, for the Tunacha peoples, for the peoples of Canada. So it might look different for us, but we can measure it and we can report on it. No problem. We need a little support, supporting each other, tools, etc. So I acknowledge that capacity for the Tunacha, and go ahead and click, please. For us, the Tunacha, it's talking about knowledge, tools, and instruments, having all three bits in place, right? So knowledge. We've gone through the process of working with the Tunacha people to define what Tunacha well-being is. We have that knowledge now. We know what it is we want to measure, but we don't have the tools yet. We don't have the data collection systems to catch that data all over the place, and we're going to have to build those. And it doesn't happen all at once. So we got to build it little by little by little as we build self-governance capacity. And then the other component of capacity, knowledge, tools, is instruments. So agreements, data sharing agreements, those types of things, policies, what have you. We know we need all of that. So for the exercise for the Tunacha, it's again, that going through that exercise, what's important to us? What do we want to measure as far as Tunacha well-being is? And then what do we want to share with the other governments? What do we need to share with the other governments or to Canadians? Because we do want people to know how well we are. Click, please. And that, when we think about the concept of data and the ownership and control and access and possession of data, and you've probably seen that acronym out there, OCAP, really ownership and control is governance. Each nation putting themselves in to take ownership and control of the data that relates to their distinct population, data sovereignty. When we think about the access and possession side of it, it's about services, it's about management, it's about those that may be stewarding our data. And we may be not have our hands on the data, but we can govern that data still. And that's why it's important that we set those standards for governance and we educate other people on what we expect of it. Example, open government, real threat for us right now. Canada wants to open all the data sets on Indians to any researcher that, it's like open data, open transparency, all of this. We're going, no. Anytime that data has a Tunacha identifier in it, that's my nation's business. If we choose to open our data to the other governments, we will do so. But no, we're not going to just allow you as the government of Canada or the government of British Columbia to determine what you share of our data with other people. No. So we know that our institutions have got to actually be the between. They've got to protect the identity, but at the same time, they've got to rejuvenate and help rebuild. So it's an internal rebuilding. At the same time, it's an external protection from threat that we've got to kind of achieve here. So putting OCAP philosophy into policy of each of our nations is an act of governance. Click again, please. And this is the last two slides. I'm sorry for going over time with you. Where we are right now, again, as a Tunacha Nation, is moving ourselves into having recognition as a government. So you see all of the language that's been evolving and the laws that have been evolving around us. The Language Act talks about Indigenous governing bodies. The Child Welfare Act federally talks about Indigenous governing bodies. BC, we've got DRIP law, and that talks about Indigenous governing bodies. It's giving this another identity, another label, right? So are you an Indigenous governing body? And so we were asking ourselves, everybody's asking themselves, and we're going, whoa, what is it? So for the Tunacha, we recognize, no, it's the rights and title holders. The Tunacha people hold those rights. The Tunacha people have the rights. The Tunacha governments assert those rights. So our next steps forward are basically on this slide here. We're going forward to ask for, seek, demand, acquire recognition as the Tunacha Indigenous governing bodies of the Tunacha Nation. Not a final treaty, not a self-government agreement, just a recognition agreement. Recognize that we are the Tunacha Indigenous governing bodies that serve the Tunacha people. We hold the rights. Through that, we also want to assert ownership over intellectual property, language, identity, anything that relates to us, and take ownership over population data. Nobody owns the Tnaqa identity but the Tnaqa people. But a lot of people abuse our identity and use our data and use researchers, et cetera, without any attachment to ownership of our intellectual property. So asserting ownership over language, identity, et cetera, it's a huge act of self-determination. Defining what data is quality to us, again, that's an act of self-determination and self-governance, setting that path forward to talk about data sharing with the other governments. And it's not a one-way thing. It's not like the Tnaqa are going to just give the other governments, here's some proof that we're doing what we should. It's bilateral and perhaps potentially two bilaterals, the government to government, government to government, where we will, because my nation serves non-Indigenous people and we serve non-Tnaqa people. We already are doing that. So they should know, as a government responsible for those people, that we are serving them and we're serving them well. So there's going to be data that flows both ways. So knowing what that is, but it's got to be quality data. It's not a data dump. We don't want the province to hear everything we got on y'all. So we've gone through a little exercise lately that Tnaqa have asked the province, show us what you have that attaches to these things that are important to us. So we've given them some indicators of Tnaqa well-being and asked them, go through your data and see if you got anything that might make meaning to us. They've done that. We're just looking at it now. Some stuff might be relevant, but for the most part, we know we're going to have to create data collection, exercises, systems, et cetera, to collect the things that are important to us because it's not important to them and there are no systems in place right now. And if we can do this collectively, we're creating systems collectively, it's really helpful because then we don't have to pay for it over and over and over and over again. Right. So it's really important that we network up and figure out how we can create collective response and approach to things that benefits us each as unique. You don't give up sovereignty, you just gain capacity by sharing, right? A very important thing there. And the very last slide, in taking those things that we're going to achieve, we're moving them into what we're calling, because it's already in existence, we're just sort of sliding ourselves into it, is a tripartite data quality and sharing agreement. And initially, we're really seeing it just as the instrument that gives us recognition as the Tnaqa Indigenous governing bodies, that then gives us that connection to the existing legislation that's out there, DRIPA, et cetera, creates the table with the Tnaqa Nation, Indigenous governing bodies, Canada and the provincial government, and then allows us to have the conversation over time about what data quality is, and then through plans and processes to eventually share data. So it's really a government to government relationship agreement right now with the philosophy embedded in it that we want, that will take time, of course, to achieve, but getting that place is really important right now. And I said to some provincial representatives yesterday on a call for BC that if we think about a tripartite data quality sharing agreement in light of the DRIPA law and what might occur nationally, it's actually an instrument that can get you what you need as far as those relationship tables, nation to nation, government to government. You don't give up your sovereignty as Indigenous governing bodies. But for example, in British Columbia, again, we showed you the languages, and Harmony is from Ayachutham speaking peoples. And those Ayachutham speaking peoples, one's a fully self-governing group under a treaty. One is partly, and two, I think, are not. So that doesn't mean that they can't put a tripartite data quality sharing agreement in place as the Ayachutham speaking peoples to protect their identity and to start whatever it is they want to do individually or collectively to assert data sovereignty and to occupy that space as Indigenous governing bodies protecting the identity of the Ayachutham speaking peoples. And so this is something that we're putting on a table in BC, and I'm encouraging others to think about, because I hope you all are aware that there is a national First Nations data governance strategy being rolled out, that there is resources going into every province and territory for engagement with chiefs and leaders in those regions on this national data strategy. And this national data strategy includes the development of a data center owned, function, or governed by, serving the nations of that province and territory. So this is early stage work, but this is something that could absolutely help to empower, help to enable your self-governing nation to move towards the data sovereignty that you want by having institutional support. So what we're intending to do from the Ktunaxa Nation in British Columbia and encouraging the other nations to do is through a tripartite data quality sharing agreement, have a section on delegation to say that as a self-governing nation, we can delegate authority to another agency to perform a task for us. And so we envision this BC First Nations Data Center being basically empowered by those 34 unique Indigenous language groupings, those Indigenous governing bodies of those groupings, empowering this institution to exist and serve them through a delegation of authority. So it's not coming from the province and feds to us, it's us actually telling and empowering this institution what they should do and could do for us, and developing the standards by which they would account to us. And so this is exciting. I hope that you will all take advantage of the opportunity to feed into that process. And if offline, if you don't know who to attach to talk to, just send some comments, questions in, and I will make sure that you do get knit into the conversations somehow. So that's the end of what I wanted to share with you. Absolutely, I know that we were hoping to have some time for questions. Harmony, you know how long-winded I am. So if anybody does have any questions, please, again, if they're not in the chat box already, just put a question in an email, send it our way, and I would absolutely be thrilled and honored to be able to respond. So thank you very much.